This is a CBC podcast.
This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Indigenous people have been living on Turtle Island since time immemorial, and that means there's a long history of traditional dwellings on this land. Much of that knowledge was interrupted due to colonialism, but Indigenous architects are finding ways to reclaim that knowledge and incorporate it into their work. Today on the show, from resisting the colonial legacy of architecture in this country to integrating Indigenous principles into design, how Indigenous people are reframing the way we look at architecture.
This is where you come in. It's like a big organic living space. This is the mouth of the space where people come in, entry this organism. I like having the building feel like it's a living organism. So here you're in the body of the structure itself.
That's architect Douglas Cardinal.
My name is Douglas Cardinal. I'm an architect here in Ottawa.
Douglas is walking inside the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. It's a building he designed, a space he calls a second home. He completed the building in 1989.
We're in the entry hall where people are greeted and introduced to the museum as a whole.
Douglas designed his first building more than 50 years ago. Since then, he's received just about every award there is for his work, from being titled an Officer of the Order of Canada to being named World Master of Contemporary Architecture by the International Association of Architects. He's often credited with creating an Indigenous style of architecture in Canada. But Indigenous architecture isn't how he describes his designs. We spoke with Douglas about his life's work at the Canadian Museum of History in a room overlooking Kitchissippi. Kitchissippi is the Algonquin word and the original name for the Ottawa River. This was recorded before the pandemic by our producer, Zoe Tennant.
Well, we're in the boardroom at the Museum of History, which I designed. I wanted to have the building feel like it was a building that was in harmony with Turtle Island, which is our Indigenous word for North America. And because the backbone of Turtle Island, the Rocky Mountains, I felt that this building should have a backbone that looks like it's being carved by the water and the rain, and so I wanted to have this feeling of a rock formation that was carved by nature, but also combining that sculpture, say, with male and female forms to remind us that we are part of nature as well. And I always objected to the idea that we were dominion over nature. If you feel that you have the ego of being dominion over nature, nature will set you back on your heels pretty quick. So one has to learn how to be more respectful of nature and our environment, because we are creating all these problems now with the planet because we're not living in harmony with our environment. And I wanted to make sure that the building would speak in that way to people. I felt that in designing the museum, my whole source of inspiration would be nature, feeling not only the environment around me, but creating environments within the spaces that would flow and people would feel more at home in these spaces, because I always felt more at home in walking in a forest, that you would flow through the forest and you would have experiences that would be natural and uplifting, and I wanted that same feeling in the building itself. Parliament turns its back on the river, and I saw that they didn't use the river to the advantage that it could be here. So I thought that this building should address the river in a very powerful way, and so the whole building relates to the river. I feel, in many ways, I feel at home with the museum here, and Mark O'Neill, who is the president, makes sure I feel at home. In fact, he even has a room for me called the Douglas Cardinal Silo. And so I feel this is my second home, that I can come and relax here. Well, all the exterior of the building is this stone they call Tindle Stone from Manitoba. This is limestone made from all the bones of prehistoric creatures. Sometimes you can see the fossils in the stone. It is a beautiful stone, and it really comes alive when the sun hits it. It just seems to glow for some reason. I grew up really next to nature, in a log cabin in the Porcupine Hills. It didn't have electricity or running water and these things. So it was really living in nature. My father built this log cabin, so it was surrounded by wood and natural materials, and he taught me to hunt and appreciate all the animals that gave us life and food. He taught me to honor these animals and because they were our life givers, and he had amazing respect for all life around him. And I still remember how important it was to work in harmony with nature and understand nature and be a part of nature. I got to really appreciate, the natural environment, and I grew up with that and learned all this from my father. My father was always building things, not only the log cabin, but all the furniture and everything. And I was always interested in that. And my mother felt that I should be an architect. And so I looked for architects to study and be trained under that were more influenced by nature, like Frank Lloyd Wright, and architects who use nature as a way of inspiring their forms, like Gaudi in Barcelona. Also the work of Rudolf Steiner, who did very organic work. His work was very spiritual as well. So these architects were my inspiration. My whole emphasis has been on organic architecture. It's because of my roots that led me to that approach to architecture. But I never thought of expressing myself as an Indigenous architect. I thought of expressing myself as an organic architect that emphasized the beauty and vitality and richness of nature. The International Academy in Architecture and internationally, they look at my work as classic organic architecture. And because I do things differently, and because of my own Indigenous roots, then people class my architecture here in Canada as Indigenous. Well, I think architecture is a very powerful art, and I class architecture as art. It should be art. It's not just mere shelter. As an art, it's very powerful because not only do you view it as a piece of sculpture, but you walk in it. It envelops your whole environment. It totally surrounds you, and therefore it can be very powerful in influencing you. And like our cities, you can shape your environments, but in turn those environments shape you. So you can see some of our cities are shaping people in a very brutal way. So we need to have our environments affect us in a very caring way. And I think that we should have more beauty and balance and nurturing in our environments, and that'll make us, influence us in a good way. I wonder, say if we designed cities with those values, what amazing cities we could design and what amazing places they could be.
That was architect Douglas Cardinal. To find out more about Douglas's work, you can head to our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. All about architecture on the show today.
It's a round building, and the design comes from the Anishinaabe pre-contact architectural form of roundhouse, which inherent in its spatial configuration is a connection to sky.
Coming up, Aladia Smoke explains how architects are using Indigenous principles of design in their work. But first, some of the world's most famous architecture is thousands of years old. And while some stood the test of time, others weren't intended to, like the teepee. The structure of the Cree teepee has remained unchanged because it holds special meaning. For her master's thesis, Christelle Clark wanted to explore that meaning and find the closest comparison to Western architecture. Clark is Nehio from Montreal Lake Cree Nation. Here's Christelle explaining what she learned when she looked into the architecture of the teepee.
During my master's, I did my thesis on the teepee, specifically teepee tectonics, or Kichi-Miigwech, which means like their traditional teepee. And so I researched the cultural significance of the teepee and how it could relate to architecture. It's a woman's structure as well. It was designed, built, and completely maintained by the women in the community or in that tribe. And so the teachings that were passed on were taught by grandmothers, and the teepee was also built by women in the community that were highly respected and very good at sewing. And so it was an honor to actually help construct the covers of the teepee, because each pole represents a different teaching. And so they all come together and they kind of build the foundation for a good life. And so that's what the teachings were really there to express. So for the teepee structure, I was exploring the hole at the top of the teepee, and a Western construction parallel comparison was the Skylight. And so I compared these two by drawing out the construction layout of each component. And what I found out with the Indigenous teepee is that it allowed the elements to kind of move through the teepee. So when it rained, the teepee would allow the water to move through the hole. So if it's raining hard, they would obviously close the flaps, but water was never meant to be completely 100% resistant. It was meant to just get the whole of it, and some of the water would still trail through the teepee. And so it would come down the inner pole, and there'd be two smaller sticks or twigs, and then it was wrapped in sinew, and then the water would trickle between those two sticks, and then it would flow down the pole all the way down onto the earth and out of the teepee, essentially. So the occupants would always stay dry. That was the main feature. The water was not resisted. And then also the same thing with air. The air moved down from that same space. So the direction the water took, the air would go in the opposite direction. It would come up from that opening, come through the teepee, and then out that smoke hole. And that would help direct all the fire smoke from the hole. It's so important to the structure of the teepee to function properly. And so when you look at the Skylight, the comparison Western construction detail, the Skylight is lets light in, and it's primarily the only purpose of the Skylight is to let the natural light in, but it's typically sealed with sealants and flashing, and it's really not designed to allow anything to come in. I think that Canada has a history of imposing architecture on Indigenous communities, and I think it's about time that Indigenous communities have control of their own structures and that they can define who they are instead of having the federal government or any type of governance impose certain conditions on them. If you look at a lot of the different reserves, maybe across Canada, you can see there's a singular typology that should not expand all of the provinces and territories. A lot of them look very similar because they were imposed on those sites, and each site is unique and different. Each landscape is unique and different, and therefore each structure and house should have a construction and to respond to the environment that they're in, right? Each one should be unique in that sense. And right now, I don't think they really respond to that.
That was Christelle Clark sharing her work around the Cree teepee. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. Talking all about Indigenous influence on architecture on the show today. Architect Aledia Smoke is Anishinaabekwe from Obishkokong Lac Seul First Nation. She's the principal architect of Smoke Architecture, an Anishinaabe-owned and operated architecture firm that focuses on Indigenous projects. It's a focus that Aledia also brings into the classroom. Aledia teaches at Laurentian University's MacEwan School of Architecture, a program that centers Indigenous principles in its curriculum. Aledia, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phelan.
So your work is guided by Indigenous principles of design. Are there some examples of Indigenous principles of design that you could give us?
Yeah, I think the one that comes through most often and most strongly is a connection to land. Most of our First Nations are really principled in how we live within our environments, and that's something that we've heard from our ancestors and from our knowledge carriers in the present day. And so oftentimes we see a connection to people as well. So that sort of flattened hierarchy where everyone is brought along is really important in a lot of the projects. So, for example, I'm working on a roundhouse for Henvey Inlet First Nation, and it's a round building, and the design comes from the Anishinaabe pre-contact architectural form of roundhouse, which inherent in its spatial configuration is a connection to sky. There are inherent gateways to the cardinal directions, and there's a direct physical connection to Earth. So we actually have a hole in the floor where we have a direct connection to Shkadamakwe. So those narratives are embedded in the space itself, along with the main doorway facing east, which is that direction of sunrise. There's a cedar planted at that door, and the space is circular because everyone who comes into the circle has an equal standing and an equal contribution to whatever goes on in that space. So it's a really sort of connection to the macrocosmic view of the principles that we hold very closely in Anishinaabe worldview. And I heard that all of these things directly from Anishinaabe people who have been, sharing these insights with me. And so that's what's come through in the architecture.
Mm-hmm. And I've read that you actually work with elders on your projects sometimes.
Oh, yes, we try to do that whenever we possibly can. So, for instance, when we did the concept design in collaboration with Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa for the Indigenous Peoples space that's intended to be across from the parliamentary precinct there in Ottawa. I worked with David Fortin, who's a Métis architect, and Wanda Della Costa, who's a Cree architect from Saddle Lake. We worked also alongside Winnie Pitawanakwat, who is an Inuit elder, and she brought forth her insights because we wanted as diverse a team as possible. So we formed the team with an elder in one of the designer roles. Mm-hmm. And so we brought her onto our team, and she had some wonderful contributions to make. For instance, I remember one thing she said was, when grandma comes up to this building, she needs to feel comfortable. Our grandmas need to immediately know this is our place. And she also said, we have to think about the people who are experiencing homelessness. They should feel welcomed as well. And you would never hear that from a mainstream proponent of an architectural project in the parliamentary precinct in our capital city, that, we have to take care of each other and everyone needs to feel comfortable in this space. And where are we going to put the children? So we had this welcome kitchen in the main level in the concept design for Indigenous people's space. And that sort of idea of Kokum's kitchen or Grandma's kitchen is a powerful theme that I've heard also from a few other Indigenous people I've worked with.
I could just imagine any building that an elder advises on has a pretty good tea cupboard.
Yeah. Yeah, when we were working on Centennial College, they had a very strong Indigenous working group. And that was the one thing that really came through. Several things came through really strongly in that project. But one thing that was like the heart and soul of the Indigenous space in that building was a space that's like Grandma's kitchen, where they envisioned students could come and access food in case they're experiencing food security issues, or they could come and hold feasts. They could prepare food outside in an interior courtyard in a traditional way and bring it in and serve it in the space. So that Grandma's kitchen feel is really strong with some of the projects I've worked on.
I bet. So why do you think that Indigenous architecture is important?
We as Indigenous peoples have lived in this territory for millennia, and our ancestors have collected and learned many things about living in coordination with our natural environment and with each other. Through the forces of colonization, Indigenous people have not been able to access these teachings and this thinking about spatial configuration. In fact, your average Canadian has had absolutely no way of accessing these incredibly rich thoughts regarding architectural space that we've had in this territory, built over millennia of living here. Somehow or other, Canada has struggled along all this time without these perspectives. And I think we see that to the detriment of our habitats, to the detriment of the health of our lands, and to the detriment of the health of our people. So I think the benefit of bringing these perspectives to bear, even in mainstream space that isn't considered Indigenous space, it's considered more mainstream space, the benefit of bringing these perspectives to those spaces that we can all enjoy is that those embedded teachings, those dynamics will start to raise the level of wellness for everyone. It'll make those spaces more engaging, more authentic, more of this place. Canadian architecture has had a habit of bringing precedents in from everywhere else, instead of consulting with and asking questions and learning about what's already here. What's already here is incredibly rich, and the experiential quality of the spaces that grow out of these understandings that are Indigenous to this place and have grown out of the long, long process of thinking hard about what it means to be human in this land really could bring a breadth of architectural thinking that we just have never seen before. These perspectives, these principles of how to live together and how to live in space are incredibly strong. And there's a limited time as well to listen to our elders and to hear the types of teachings that they have managed to collect and keep safe over the course of incredible hardship. Those elders are getting older. Now is the time to listen to them.
And so you also teach architecture at Laurentian University. How do you bring Indigenous design principles into the classroom?
I teach a course called Indigenous Precedents. In that course, I invite guest speakers from across the continent, illustrious Indigenous designers, and there are not very many of us, but but hopefully there will be more in future. And I invite these speakers to speak to the class There's a wonderful book called Our Voices, and it showcased Indigenous voices in architecture, and it was the first of its kind here in Canada. Now there's another book that's come out, the Contemporary Handbook of Indigenous Architecture, and those two texts are the very first of their kind. They only just came out in 2018. I use those resources in my class because it's so exciting to me. These things have never been written down before.
So as a field, how diverse would you say that architecture is?
Architecture has a big diversity issue. Historically, it's been white, male, and definitely from a higher echelon of income. It is lagging behind professions such as law and medicine, who have made some strides in diversity, but architecture is lagging behind because I think a lot of the issues that our students would never even dream of entering this profession. It just doesn't even seem something that's real because it's never represented us. And so the notion of being an architect and actually being part of bringing that identity into our spaces, our cities, our buildings, our shared outdoor areas, this doesn't even seem possible. It doesn't even seem like something that would enter one's head. So I think supporting young students coming out of high school to imagine themselves in this building industry, in the architectural professions, is really critical. So we have to support our young people to become professionals. The more diverse architecture can be, the stronger it will be, the more breadth of design work we will see, the richer the environments will be, the more responsive and resilient to future impacts it will be. As we build space together, it's important that we are building space together.
Well, Aledia, thank you for speaking with me today.
My pleasure.
Architect Aledia Smoke is Anishinaabekwe from Obishkokong Lac-Seul First Nation. She's the principal architect at Smoke Architecture. In a profession with so few Indigenous people, collectives for a unified voice become even more important. Some students at the Yale School of Architecture felt the same way. The Indigenous Scholars of Architecture, Planning and Design, or ISAPD, started as a way to connect Indigenous designers, planners, and architects to one another. They focus on increasing the knowledge, consciousness, and appreciation of Indigenous architecture at the school. 2 of the 3 students who co-funded the group explain its role today.
My name is Summer Sutton, and I'm finishing up my PhD at Yale University in the School of Architecture. I'm from the Lumbee tribe in present-day North Carolina, where my family is now. The Indigenous Scholars of Architecture, Planning and Design started in September of 2018. 3 of us met at the Native American Cultural Center at Yale, and we identified each other as being part of the architecture department. And that was an eye-opening moment because I had never been in an architecture department that actually had other Indigenous students and colleagues. But I think what was important about the 3 of us being aware of each other's presence is that we were all interested in architecture or even just Indigenous issues. So I think that's what the basis of ISAPD has been built off of, which is the idea that we are interested in designing with respect to Indigenous related issues. Because you can be an Indigenous architect without designing for Indigenous people.
So I'm Angelica Gallegos. I'm getting my Master's of Architecture degree at Yale. I'm in my 3rd year right now. I'm from the Santa Ana Pueblo and Hickory Apache Nation, which are both located in New Mexico. I think each of us recognize that there's a need for Indigenous voices in the architecture field, and that includes in the curriculum, practice, and creative or experimental areas. Not unlike most fields in education, I think Native voices and architecture have hardly been mentioned in actual history courses.
I think that's a really interesting point because architecture can be so invasive to the environment. And so how do contemporary Indigenous architects operate in an industry and a practice that can be damaging? Because in a lot of ways, architecture is about the process of land management, and that involves maintaining relationships. architecture doesn't work without an acknowledgement of that. And for those who design with that as a priority, whether it's for Indigenous people, with an acknowledgement of being on Indigenous land, or as an architectural practice on its own, regardless of who's designing it, I think it's important to understand those protocols, history, practices of Indigenous architecture and design in order to really solidify successful ways of managing relations with the environment. This isn't something new. I think as Indigenous students in a university academic setting, there's a lot of forging new paths, even in our generations. So it doesn't feel like something new. It's only if you're up for pushing it further, which I think is what also made ISAPD so successful, because all three of us who established the organization had that drive to push it further. And I'd say that a lot of that drive comes from being with other colleagues who have similar interests, and you're not alone. And that really helps the momentum. The momentum to keep going is based on the community that you have, whether it's your own community back home or it's in your academic institution. In this case, it was, for me, fostered among our group.
That was Summer Sutton and Angelica Granco talking about the Indigenous Scholars of Architecture Planning and Design. It's a student group they co-founded with Charel Brown to promote Indigenous architecture at Yale. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Phelan Johnson. We're talking all about Indigenous architecture on the show today. Patrick Stewart is an architect with many firsts. He was the first Indigenous president of the Architectural Association in Canada, the first Indigenous president of the Architectural Institute of BC, and the first Indigenous person in British Columbia to own and operate an architectural firm. Patrick is a professor of architecture at Laurentian University. His list of accomplishments is long, and his journey has been long too. Patrick is Niska, and he joins me from his home on Chiatin First Nation in Stolo territory. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, do you remember when you were first drawn to architecture?
Well, I was first interested when I was 5 years old.
And what was it when you were that young? That seems like such a young age to be interested in architecture for a young 5-year-old. How did it come about?
Well, I guess it was more about the buildings. I was interested in buildings. When I was 5, it was a different time, and I could walk to kindergarten and walk the city streets. I would walk from the school home, and I would go out of my way to look at particular buildings. You
now have a PhD and your own architecture firm. Was it a straight road to where you ended up today?
No, it wasn't straight. I grew up in Care. I always say I was born homeless because my mom was homeless when I was born. I didn't like school, public school. I didn't do well. I moved a lot growing up, and I was always the new kid. I was always the only Aboriginal kid, and, that had its own issues, and so school was not easy. As I grew into high school, I thought, what would it take to get into architecture? And I would go to the library in high school and get a university catalog and look. But then things were happening in my home, and I sort of just shut down. I was skipping school. I wasn't performing. I wasn't completing assignments, and that's why I really didn't do well in the end. But I also didn't have anybody to really sort of counsel me and say, smart up. I was pretty much just left to do what I wanted to do, I guess. I thought, well, there goes architecture. And I didn't know what else I was going to do. So I graduated high school. But in those days, the local college were taking people that graduated, and I got into college and didn't do well. It took me a while to figure things out. By that time, I'd aged out of Care, so I was on my own. I was gone from my foster parents. I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And I did get a letter of acceptance to SFU, which of course doesn't have architecture, but I thought, okay, well, at least I'm at a university. I thought, I can still get to architecture. I bet you I can. So I thought first thing I need to do is prove to people or prove to myself that I could do the math. So I enrolled in the calculus course. And, in one of the midterms, I got 96%. And I thought, hey, I can do this. And during that time, I met somebody who was in the School of Architecture. He was at what is now Dalhousie. And they had a different concept on requirements and what students needed to have to get into the school. I applied and didn't get in. And they just said, finish your degree, reapply, and we'll see. And so I did, and I got in. And I just still remember the day that I walked up to that school and the feeling of walking up those big stone steps and thinking, hey, I made it. I actually did it.
That must have been quite a moment for you to see all the hard work, that you've done come to fruition. So you mentioned that you grew up in the foster care system. Would you say that has influenced your work or, what you want to work on as an architect?
It's opened up possibilities for projects, working with organizations who deal with children in care. So when we did the Aboriginal Children's Village in Vancouver, the society, the nonprofit Illuminative Housing Society, they talked to me and said, well, it's because you were in care that we think you would be a good fit for this project. And it was dealing with kids in care, and there was going to be support in the building for the youth in care. So Luma runs a youth mentorship program, and there were counselors in the building, and we had designed some studio units in there. So when you age out, you move into a studio unit, learn independent living, but still have supports in the building.
For listeners who might not be familiar with the Aboriginal Children's Village, could you describe the building to us?
So the official name is the Bay Pronto Aboriginal Children's Village, and it is 24 apartments from studios to 4-bedroom. There are commercial spaces on the ground floor, and there are amenity spaces in the building. So there's a big amenity room with a kitchen, and that's where the youth make meals. So they'll meet down there. There is a games room on the second floor in the building. We had designed a space in the basement with big garage doors out the back for like carving space. And right now we're actually adding a sweat lodge in the backyard. The intent of the design was to emphasize like a village. And so thinking of the elements of a longhouse and, the facades of longhouses as they, step down the beach. So I did that stepping down the street. And, we had house poles carved for the main entrance.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about the space, because in some ways it sounds like it's a return to traditional structures. How do you think those traditional structures are types of knowledge?
Architecture based on Indigenous knowledge is continuing a history that is known in the communities. There's been an interruption in life in First Nations communities where kids were taken away, put in residential schools, and there was an attempt by the government to break the cultures and take language away and disrupt our communities. And they burnt down villages, they chopped down totem poles and floated them away on the West Coast to museums. But the idea that we could still design buildings based on community histories is something that I was really interested in, because the culture was still there, the language was still there, and it's not like they didn't defeat us. The language, the culture just went underground. The knowledge was still there. Every First Nation has their traditional forms. I've worked with nations where the pit house is their traditional winter dwelling, and that has been a form that I have worked with in my designs. And one of the communities I worked in, one of the elders came out and with his foot, he stepped off the proportions of a longhouse and said, this is where we'll build it, this is how we'll build it. And he had all that information that he had learned. I just find that a very strong and very cultural response to to colonization.
I'm curious, how do you think design and architecture can be a form of resistance? Can it?
It can, and it is, especially when you consider the use of traditional form. To me, I look at it and it's a way of indigenization, maybe not a way of decolonization, but in the end, it is a way that empowers First Nations. To me, that's very important.
And so for any aspiring Indigenous architects who may be listening to this interview, what advice would you give them?
Not to give up and don't waver from the goals you've set yourself, because there's very many hurdles. And also look for help. That's one of the things that when I was coming up, that there were very few, well, there was only one other architect in this country that was Indigenous, that's Douglas Cardinal. And, he's now 86, still practicing. He was sort of the only role model that I had in architecture school. We have Indigenous architects across the country. I think we're up to 18 right now, which isn't a lot. And when you think of, since the repeal of the Indian Act and we could go to university, we're really, the first generation or two of architects or of Indigenous people that could go into architecture. I talk about taking the long view and think, well, there's only 18 of us in the country right now as Indigenous architects, but, in the next couple of generations, maybe we'll triple our numbers. Schools of architecture now are starting to think about things Indigenous. I think there is a great future in architecture for Indigenous students.
Well, Patrick, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Patrick Stewart is a Nisga'a architect. To find out more about Patrick's work, you can head to our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. This episode was produced by Zoe Tennant, Kyle Musica, Sean Vanderklis, and Anna Lazowski. I'm Phelan Johnson. Now go for listening.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.